Compact, or EMAC. And with most really good ideas, EMAC did not come from Washington. It came from the states in the 90s. Once a governor, always a governor. This idea didn't originate in Washington. It originated in states. It was eventually adopted in Washington, but it was not of Washington. I recall the early days following September 11th. One of the challenges faced by the states as they reconsidered response to catastrophic events in the post-9/11 world was that whole issue of mutual aid, states helping states, communities helping communities. There was certainly the desire to support one another, but there were questions of budget, legal liability, the whole scenario. The body politic was weak. At the time, it didn't quite figure out how to deal with the legal barriers or the budget problems. While we had EMAC in place, too few jurisdictions had actually signed and entered into the compact. So there remained widespread challenges in terms of reimbursement and liability that hindered the ability of states to come together to one another's aid following a disaster. But with the leadership of state and local emergency managers, presumably some in this room, many of whom served as the state's Homeland Security advisors as well, and with the work of the National Emergency Management Association, EMAC was strengthened, and today all 50 U.S. states have ratified participation. And the strengthening of EMAC has certainly been a success over the last decade, and many of you today have a part in it. More importantly, it's a very timely reminder of how critical partnerships are. I might say, by the way, to our friends from foreign countries, this whole EMAC relationship, one political jurisdiction tied into the other, is a pretty good model, pretty good example for you to explore while you're here with your fellow emergency managers from the states. In the case of EMAC, it's primarily government-to-government aid. But nonetheless, there is that recognition when it comes to disasters, we can't do it alone, whether we are either a public or a private entity, whether we are one country or many. I think we all understand that after 9/11, when it came to disaster response, we would have to learn to do things differently and certainly a lot better. Many of you, some of you in the room may have heard me say, Homeland Security is not just the work of the federal government. It's the work of a nation. Equally with international incidents, earthquake, tsunami, terrorist event, response is not the work of one nation. It must be the work of a family of nations. Now, here in the United States, after 9/11, the very premise of a national mission involved the United States coming to grips with the understanding that everything we do must be a shared effort. There is a shared responsibility. That was at the core of the first National Strategy for Homeland Security in 2002 that we drafted when I was in the White House. And frankly, make no mistake about it, that whole notion that it's a shared responsibility was a cultural change for many of the institutions in Washington, D.C. When we first stood up the department in 2003, it required that we look at how agencies work across the federal government, but also how we can work better with our state and local authorities, the private sector, and academia. We had to redefine how we work with one another. In particular, how and with whom we share information. Whether you're on the battlefield, the conventional war, dealing with terrorism, or you're trying to deal in the aftermath of a natural disaster, the decision makers need to get timely and accurate information so they can plot a course or work their way through whatever the situation is. That was and continues to be, in my judgment, still a bit of a challenge at the federal level. And particularly sharing that information back on down with the groups that I consider to be the partners, and that's the governors, the big city mayors, the first responders, the police chiefs. In Washington, we had to let go of turf and a horrible lack of communication and willingness to share information. As a department and as a country, I think we've made great progress. We're certainly better prepared than we were before 9/11. And the way in which we delivered a unified, appropriately tiered approach, federal, state, and local level response efforts, has been enhanced again over the last decade by the National Response Plan, which evolved in the post-Katrina world, the National Response Framework. Meanwhile, the development of and subsequent provisions of the National Incident Management System that clarify roles and responsibilities for incident managers at all levels of government and with non-government stakeholders. And again, I think this is a good model for your friends from overseas to take a look at. A great conversation last night with several members of the Homeland Security and Preparedness Office here in Louisiana, and asked about the operation centers and application of NAMs throughout. And frankly, it was very rewarding to listen how they've embedded it. And frankly, it's been done in all 50 states. Everybody operating, at least at the outset, with a common platform. Obviously, some differences depending on the state and the region, but two very significant changes in the past decade. And at the end of the day, while they emanated from Washington, I must tell you, when we drafted them both, we sat down with the state and local emergency managers, the first responders, that you had to execute the game plan, and it is about building a game plan. Your fingerprints are all over. It was a shared responsibility to draft it. It's a shared responsibility to execute it. And I think it's one of the most significant improvements and changes we made in the past decade.